part, we've talked about the struggle that we know, the endurance that is required of us as Christians, as followers of Christ. But as Noah aptly put it this morning, it's going to require a lot, but what we gain from it is immeasurable, and it's certainly worth it. Specifically, on Wednesday, we started the idea of God the living, we are servants, right? So we're talking about, we are, fill in the blank, as followers of Christ, we are servants, we are disciples, we are saints, sanctified, and so we're continuing down, this idea of what it means to be a saint. Because we've been sanctified, we've been justified, and so we're asking the question, for what purpose? And that's what we're trying to answer in this section of classes. So on Wednesday, we talked about the word doulos and how that, especially in the ESV, has it's translated servant, bondservant, or slave, depending upon the translator's interpretation of the context. A lot of times it's just servant. But we have this idea, again, aptly put this morning, when Paul says, I am Christ's. So you have this idea of a master, and you have this idea of a servant or a slave. And if Jesus is reigning, in my life, if he's the master of my life, what are some of the implications of that? And so we talked about the importance of humility when we're servants, the attitude of, having an attitude of humility, how that plays a part. We talked about how throughout Scripture we saw servants and slaves having a tremendous impact on those around them. So we talked about Joseph, we talked about and his friends, Esther. Paul in his letters in Romans, Philippians, and Titus, and James, and Peter, and in their letters, they reference themselves. They gladly and freely call themselves a servant or a slave of Jesus Christ. As the servant, the slave, and as Jesus as our master. All right, William, will you say a word of prayer for us? Thanks, William. All right, so the first passage we're going to look at this morning is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and we're going to look at verses 19 and 20. So if you take your Bibles, we'll go to 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20, and I'll ask to have a reader for that passage. Yeah, thanks, Taylor. Thank you. Okay, so two verses here in the context of Jesus is the master and we are the servants. The context of 1 Corinthians, Paul is exhorting them to flee from sexual immorality. So in verse 13, he writes that the body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And so really the concept of my body is not my own, starts with that idea. my body is not meant for this, but rather it's meant for this. And that points us back to the idea of sanctification. This would have been something that they would have been participating in prior, and maybe even currently when that was written. And he's saying it's not meant for this, but you need to move away from that and move towards this. And so it is clear that Jesus does not want us to use our bodies for sexual immorality. And in the context, it says, "For you were bought with the price, so glorify God in your body." And so I ask the question, and it's right here, what gives Jesus the right to tell me what to do with my body? Why does Jesus have a claim to my body? Steve?
I like to think about the opening passage of John, where the Word was with God, was God, created all things, became flesh, and dwelt among us, and we denied His existence, we denied who He was. I would look to, obviously, crucifixion and show how choosing our own way in making the losses and defeat all losses and holding that up to pierce that loss and fail. It's just, it's pure, it's holy, the Son of God. Jesus has every right, being in control, to demand whatever it is that we're to live the life of Abraham, be His will. He created all things, so by that very nature, and then stepped into that creation and coupled Himself with that creation to show a love that could not even be fathomed. So yes, God, Christ, has the authority to ask whatever at any time, at any point.
Very good. So what you had there, I think, were two main pieces. One, He is the creator. He was there at the beginning when all things were created. And so certainly the potter has the right to do with the clay in which what he wants. So the idea of we are the creation, He is the creator, but also the idea of, okay, we got ourselves into a mess that we could not escape from. And so Jesus had to go far beyond anything imaginable to save us from that pit. And because of that also, He has a right. So the creator, and then He paid the ultimate price for who we are. So going back to the concept of a servant and a master, I have been purchased for the purpose, and so therefore it is no longer my body, my choice. It is no longer my will be done, certainly Jesus' will. And so going back to the previous classes, I now get to wear the name saint, as all Christians do. He paid the price, and now I get to wear the name saint. I was sanctified and justified through the shedding of Jesus' blood. So not only do I wear the name because Jesus died for me, but He paid the price, which is why, logically, He has the right to tell me how to live my life. So if I want to continue to wear the name, then I better allow the one who paid the price to dictate what I do. And that's what's being talked about here, right? There was a lack of awareness or knowledge or motivation or whatever it was. There was a lack of something in the Corinthian brethren that was saying, hey, you are continuing in this, so you need to know that's not acceptable. Jesus would not have you to continue in sexual immorality. Rather, He would have you stop that and start glorifying God in your body. Why? Because you were bought with a price. And what does that mean? Jesus is the master, and we are the servant. The saint's mindset makes the phrase, my body, my choice, illogical, because it's no longer my body. You no longer have free reign over it, right? And if I don't have free reign over my body, and it is Christ's body, questions like, well, what ought I to be doing with my body, comes into play. How should I act? What would Jesus have me do with my body? And there's a lot of aspects of that. Practically speaking, for the Christian today, for the saint today, for the sanctified, trying to continue in sanctification, like we sing a song with the kids. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. Be careful, little feet, where you go. Be careful, little ears, what you hear. Be careful, little hands, what you do. And it's not about crossing specific lines and I don't think that's certainly a part of it. But the more important piece of it is, if Christ is my master and I am the servant, and I'm trying to get closer to him, then I'm going to be asking proactive questions as what would Christ have me do with my body? And how can I be growing closer to God and growing closer to holiness and participating in 2 Peter chapter 1, which we've already studied in this class? Those are the types of questions, and the reality of Christ is my master and I am the servant, that's the implication for my body. It's no longer my body, my choice, but let Jesus' will be done in my body. He has the right. So a quick 2 verses. I think the point is pretty obvious, pretty clear. Any other comments before we move on to the next passage? Doug? Sure. Yeah, when the people were asking for a king, God told Samuel to make sure the people knew the implications of what a king is. Christ is our king, and certainly he has the right to give us direction and commandments on what we're to do and not do with our bodies. That's good point. Drew? Very good. Yeah, we would have an insurmountable issue or debt if Christ had taken that approach. My body, certainly we benefited from his sacrificial love in that regard. Joyce? Very good.
by pointing to him. So you got to worship him in your whole body. You glorify him with that whole body.
Paul?
So to what you said earlier, I always appreciate Paul as an apostle, but as a preacher, was always taking advantage of opportunities to motivate his audience towards sanctification and godly living. And to these Corinthians, he reminded them in verse 11, such were some of you. If the unrighteous cannot inherit the kingdom, and you were unrighteous, how is a man declared by God righteous? Only through the work of Jesus Christ. You've been washed and sanctified through the blood of Jesus. So what does that kind of spirit and attitude in me say when I join myself to Christ? I owe him everything.
Very good. Okay. So let's move on to Matthew chapter 6, 19 through 24. Matthew 6, 19 through 24. Can I have a reader for passage, William?
Matthew 6, 19 through 24. Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy. These break in and steal, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. But then the light that is in you is darkness. How great is the darkness? You cannot serve two masters, for either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth.
Good. So I think a key concept here, which is a fairly, I think, obvious one, but it's still nonetheless very key, is this idea of we can't have multiple masters, right? We have to pick one, and there can only be just the one. And I liked what was brought out. John, Jeff? He wants our loyalty. Ultimately, like, set up or fully said with, he wants our hearts, right? He wants our hearts. He wants our devotion. He wants our whole being. So that attitude of he wants our hearts, it isn't going to be, to Travis's point, someone who's trying to the fence, right? He wants all of us. So our goal is not to see how close. Our goal is to how can I glorify God, period. And so what's said here is our hearts will be with our treasure. And we're told as servants, hey, like if you want to continue to serve the master, if you want to be put in the best possible chance to continue in your servitude, your hearts are going to be with your treasure, so your treasure needs to be in heaven. I ask a question, like, don't I have a good heart already to put my treasure in heaven in the first place? So tell me, which follows which, the treasure or the heart? What comes first? Which follows which, the treasure or the heart? William?
This is all about desire. Replace wealth with it. It's all about desire. Do you desire Christ? Do you desire God? And what does all this mean for our Christian walk, quote unquote? We see too often sometimes this pattern, and I'm sorry if no one can see this, but it's like this pattern of dipping in and out. that's where the treasure's at.
Yeah, I liked what you said. If we are looking at everything through the lens of I am Jesus's, then everything that comes my way is going to be filtered through that lens. How can I use this to the advantage, to the glory of God? And when that's my attitude, then things are going well, right? When that's my attitude and that's my approach to life, then I don't have to worry about the impending coming of the end of age, whenever that might be, right? And I think your point on we always assume that we're going to live to the ripe old age of 85, like we're going to get to some passages here in a minute that talk about that. But certainly if we do live our lives looking through the lens of what can I am a servant of Jesus, and if that impacts everything of my, every part of my life, then I don't have anything to be concerned about or worried about. Very good. Skylar?
William's initial statement, which was, this is all about desire, is 100% on point. And the interesting thing about this passage that's kind of making me think a little differently right now is it's not as if you can just say, serve no one. The reality is you serve someone. You will be a servant, and you are a servant. The question is who or what do you serve? And our desire is everything. What do you actually want in your life? And if we can honestly come by the answer to that question, then we'll figure it out. And we can modify our desires and change them to be in line with Christ. But if we excuse ourselves and say, hey, like dipping my toes into Christianity or whatever, it's not all in, but it's just I show up and whatever else. And, when somebody asks me, I say, yeah, I believe in Christ, but that's about it. Well, what is the reigning principle in your life? What are you really after, and where is your treasure in reality?
Susie? Suzanne said that Paul often says from the pulpit that it's a heart issue, and so whether we're serving Jesus or not, it's all depending upon where our heart is, and I think that's spot on. And I also want to say to Skylar's point, absolutely true. We are serving someone, right? Either we're serving ourselves, or and ultimately, then the implications of that are, Satan and his angels, or demons rather, or we're serving God. So like those are really that's it. We're either serving ourselves and Satan, or we're serving God. And so like at the very highest level, we have to make a choice. And I think this is saying, look, like if you want to serve Jesus with all of your heart, soul and mind, if you want to love Jesus, then you need to be wary of, you need to be careful where your treasure is, or your perceived treasure. Put it in things that are wholesome and good, right? Like put your value system based upon the good of others. Put your value system on your relationship with Jesus, not on anything else, right? Like not, and you can fill in the blank, whatever the other things might be. But he's saying, put your heart in heaven, put your treasure in heaven. And one of the things that I was getting at, with my question, was, what comes first, the treasure or the heart? And I would say, I think it depends on where you are in your walk with Jesus. And what I mean by that is, how mature is your faith, and how is your thinking? We talked about, in a prior class how, a child will will follow by fear. And as that child grows up and matures and understands better and has a better appreciation and has grown in their sanctification, then a love will be the motivating factor, right? Eric and I had a conversation the other day. Maybe for some of us it's not difficult to know. It's not difficult to know, what to do for someone, right? Like, I may not know you very well, but I know that it's good, for this to be done, so I'm going to go do it. But for others, it may be very easy to know what is good and want to do what is good, but they simply don't have the time, or they don't make it important. And I think what's key for us is to know that if we're putting our treasure and our motivations and our wants into what Jesus wants, then either way we're going to be motivated and we're going to get things done for Him. And it's not about the works. It's about growing closer to Jesus. Drew?
This is really a striking passage because Jesus is speaking to the natural world around him. Everything is either decaying or rusting in time, or it is corrupt and people will break and steal and take, right? And so he's saying that treasure is there. Eventually we understand he is that treasure, that being with him, and it's really impressive that we can come to Jesus and know that not only did he die for us and my sins and my filthy desires, and I can reset with him every moment, every day, but for all of humanity. And that opens up the compassion to even those who will break in and steal.
Good. Any other thoughts on this passage? Yes.
The idea of heart here, and we all know heart is not necessarily the thing that pumps in the chest. That's only, it's called that because that's in the center of our body. But it means the throne of our thoughts. And I think it goes back to our intents and our desires. And what is at the heart of us. Everything comes from that. He said, what goes in the mouth doesn't defile a man, but what comes out of the mouth defiles a man, because what comes out of the mouth comes from that heart, from that center. All of our thoughts, everything we are. A lot of people can fool you for a little while, but eventually their words will reveal who they are to everyone, and it will become known. And I believe the Bible teaches that. And this word here used for treasure isn't like a treasure chest. It's what profits you. What you consider to be a profit to you is that which is being defined. So what is it? I like ice cream, but that doesn't mean necessarily that is profitable. But it is truly where our heart is and what our intentions are when we do things. We're going to mess up, I think. The Bible tells us we're going to mess up. 1 John says that, you say you're without a sin, you're lying. But when we mess up, do we really seek then to make it right through Christ? So our works do matter, but more importantly is our intentions of those works, of that which we say and that which we do to others. I think that is at the heart of what we're saying. And if Christ owns us, if he is our master and we are his servant, and we talked about Wednesday, that means that I'm not a servant because of some iron fist, but rather because of what Christ has done to me. I think that's exactly what you're doing.
Very good. All right, so let's go to Matthew chapter 25. And we're going to read 14 through 30. I'll read one, Matthew 25, 14 through 30. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. One gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He had received the 5 talents, went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid. And I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers. And on my coming, I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who was the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. For from the one who has not, what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outhouse, in the place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So this passage falls in the middle of several passages that reference the return of Jesus, and then the judgment day. Matthew 24:30 says, Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Matthew 24:36 through 51 references people in Noah's time that would have been living life as normal, living life, going about their business as usual when the flood started. It talks about the wise and the wicked servant later on, talks about the wise and wicked servant, how one was ready and waiting for the master's return, and one was living wickedly when the master returned. And then Matthew 25:1 through 13 talks about the 10 virgins and how the wise were prepared and were able to enter into the marriage feast, but the unwise were shut out. So now, and then Matthew 25:31 through 46, after the passage we read, the final judgment with the goats and the sheep, separated based on how they treated the least of these. So that's the context. That's where this passage is. And so it makes sense that this passage, too, is talking about Judgment Day. In verse 19, now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So Jesus, the master, gave them a task. He returned, and they had to give an account. And we've talked about passages that reference that thought before. So we find in this specific passage, you have a master who's leaving on a journey, but will be returning. And the master calls his servants, doulos, and entrusts them with his property. So he's giving them assets, property, money to invest, whatever you want to call it. He's giving them a task, and he's giving them ammunition and the ability to go earn. Now, not all servants are entrusted with the same amount. Verse 15 tells us that the determining factor for how much was to be entrusted was each to his ability. We're going to talk a little bit more about this here in a minute. But in verse 16, I think we can make the conclusion that it's possible that all 3 servants were given their amount of property or assets or money to invest according to their ability in front of one another. I think you could at least make a conclusion. And so for us as servants, with Jesus as our master, and in other places, in our life where we're serving, I want to ask, what pitfalls do you think were avoided? What pitfalls do you think were avoided in verse 16 where it says that he immediately went out? So the person with 5 talents immediately went out and started to work. What pitfalls do you think were avoided by him getting to work immediately? And what do you think motivated him to do so? Steve?
I think the longer you hold on to something and the longer you think about something, the less likely you are to do something about it. I know in my life, when there's a sum of account that I have that I can spend a lot of time thinking about it and not a lot of time doing something about it. So I think just the immediacy of executing what he could, I think that's pretty important.
So the longer I delay, the longer I wait, the less likely I am to follow through or to accomplish the task. I think that's good. What other pitfalls would he be avoiding, Doug?
One of the things that would motivate him to go out immediately is his relationship with his master. He respects the authority of his master, he's going to act on where his master has told him he's going to do it.
Good. Yeah. Right. So I like the language of seizing the day. He's been given a task, and to William's point, we don't know when that's going to be, right? Like we don't know when that return is going to be. We've been given a task, or he was given a task, and so he wisely immediately went out and started to work. So just, with the attitude of, like, I'll do it tomorrow, it's easy to lose track of time. And it's also easy to have our motivations, our goals, creep in the longer we wait to start the work of the master. We can certainly get sidetracked. With the break from the master's goals comes the temptation to have my goals reign supreme. And that's, getting back to the idea of not being able to serve two masters. Like when I have one master who I need to be serving Jesus, I'm constantly trying to put aside like my goals, my desires, my wishes, and ask, what does Jesus need from me? What does God need from me? Skylar. Yeah. So being stymied by fear isn't going to be an excuse we can use. Yeah. Cade?
To piggyback off of that, here's one of the questions we never see God have in the Bible, and we don't even see fear occur in creation until Genesis 3 with sin. And we're serving a master that has no fear. Why should we fear?
Very good. Very good. I like that because you have this idea of, okay, there's the master and the servant. And when that relationship starting, and now I'm talking, very practically. Like if you've got the master tradesman with the apprentice, there's going to be this training, there's going to be this teaching, there's going to be this idea of, okay, if I want to be like that, then I have to learn and I then have to emulate, right? And then as an apprentice, trying to do good work for the master tradesman, whoever that might be, I am going to, my number one goal is going to be emulating that example. And all of my efforts are going to drive toward the benefit of my master. And that was a really well said point. Our God doesn't fear. So let's try to get that away from who we are. Thank you, Skylar. Thanks, Kate. Drew?
I was along with that same thought. It's approaching the throne of grace with confidence. Eagerly handing him the life that he's given to you back to him and saying, this is what I did with what you gave me. That hope is, that confidence that you have in that hope is so wonderful. And you see the contrast with the fear. It's prayer. And as opposed to approaching the master with confidence.
Yeah. So both the 5-talent and the 2-talent servants, were said to have gone out immediately and started working, right? And we know inevitably the ending for them was very positive and very good. So like the application for us is, to Skylar's point, when we know something needs to get done, we see an opportunity, we see a need, like let's not delay because the master would have us to go take care of that. So this is what I was getting at earlier. I just had my points mixed up. I do think that the language says, hey, like possible they would have seen each other get in their talents. And it does say that according to their ability. So trying to get in the head of the 2-talent servant, and also touching back on a point we talked about on Wednesday with the idea of humility, overcoming ego, overcoming like our reputation when it comes to serving a master. So getting in the head of the 2-talent servant, what demons do you think he possibly had to battle, seeing his peer receiving more according to his ability? So they received according to their ability, and someone else over here, he was given more to work with. Like, how to overcome something in that situation? Steve?
It feels that that's a translation onto commuting something onto the text that may not be clear. It's interesting to me that the text mentions nothing about any of the talent servants looking on what the others possessed. It's completely absent from the text. So I don't know that the thought is there or the idea is there. I mean, certainly we deal with that in our own lives. Looking at a preacher that gets to stand up in the audience or a song leader that completely knocks it out of the park and makes you cry every time he sings. And I wish I could do that. And I think that across in our lives. But this particular text, there's evidence that any of the servants, the income man on the few talent man or income man on the big talent man, that there was anything at all. Just that this was the master going to go out and do it. At least for the first time.
Yeah, and I may be projecting here, like how I would interpret this or how I would have accomplished this goal, like if I was going out on a journey. But I think the language in verse 14, for it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted. So that could have been separate. It could have been at the same time. So to your point, maybe they didn't know, the inner workings of the deal. Right? No, that's true. Yeah. Carl?
Both the 5 and the 2, they both had adequate trust. So really what's being contrasted is they both had trust versus the man with 1 talent, he had fear.
Yeah. Paul?
A temptation at times is for me to compare myself with another person. And in making a false comparison, I don't have the right view of God. said, I planted, Apollos watered. God gives the increase. What God gave to me, Paul, what God gave to Apollos is God's business, not mine. So I don't need to get caught up in, does God favor one over the other based upon ability? No, God says each the same. It's just the difference in ability.
Yeah. And thank you for that. That's where I was headed. I only have the ability that's been given to me. So my assignment from the master, in a worldly example or spiritual example, the assignment that I'm given from the master is enough. And the more I focus on others and what they've been given, whether it's ability-wise or their task-wise, is it more important than mine? Like any leaning towards that way of thinking is detrimental to the job that I've been given. And that job, that task, is enough. And if I can focus on that, and I can focus on, hey, the master has given me a task, whatever it is, and you can get into, the passages where, some of us have been, given these talents, some of us have been given these talents. Whatever it is, if I focus on what have I been given, what have I been given stewardship of, what have I been given responsibility for, what needs have been put in front of me, what opportunities are in front of me, how can I go do good for the kingdom and for the master? If I focus on that and not focus on anything else, right, then I am likely to be in a much better mental state to keep focused on the task at hand, my task at hand, no one else's. And that's really that's where I was headed with that question.
Do you think, though, too many of us want to undersell the talents that we have so that we don't have an account? Do you think that there's a lot of people who say, well, I can't, and they can? My grandmother used to always say, can't doesn't do anything. And too many people in this day and age, when it's so easy to push a button and wash clothes and instantly do this and instantly do that, we're just a little bit possibly mentally lazy to the point where we just don't see or don't want to see the talents in which we have at our disposal so that we're not held an account for that which we have.
I think there's several things that can derail us, right? Like, so that the one talent man was called the wicked and slothful servant. Like, he was lazy, and he used the excuse of fear to not take action, right? So whether it's focusing on other people, whether it's being jealous or envious, whether it's not being humble, or whether it's being slothful or fearful, we have to overcome those and stay on course with the task we've been given, and that's enough. All right, thanks for the comment.